And coming up on this week's Green Signals. No signals. The Northern City Line becomes our first mainline commuter railway to run on digital signals alone. West Coast Railways is reported to have run a passenger train with non-compliant Mark 1 coaches. And the Jacobite is also being heavily criticised. Lord Blunkett proposes a £14 billion 15-year plan for Yorkshire. But is it realistic? Welcome to Green Signals from me, Nigel Harris. I'm freshly back from holiday.
Me, Richard Bowker.
Relaxed and raring to go, eh, Rich?
Chilled.
For which read hungover. Anyway, it's been a bit of a momentous week for the railway, hasn't it, Richard? Because this week, the Great Northern City Line between Finsbury Park and Moorgate has become the UK's first commuter railway to operate without signals at the side of the track. The signals were physically removed over the weekend of May 17th and 18th as part of the East Coast Digital Programme, and the line now operates digital signalling via ETCS, European Train Control System, using in-cab screens for movement authority. It's the first no-signals conversion since the Cambrian Line pilot way back in 2011. Richard was able to speak to Network Rail's ECDP Industry Partnership Director, Ed Akers, and Go Via Thameslink Railway Head of ERTMS and Digital Signalling, Ollie Turner, to find out more.
Well, welcome, Ed and Ollie, to Green Signals. Thank you for joining us. I should just explain to everybody, Ed, you're the Industry Programme Director for East Coast Digital Programme, for the Digital Signalling Programme for Network Rail. Ollie, you're Head of Digital Signalling at Go Via Thameslink Railway, GTR, as many know it. So thank you for coming on the programme. It's been a huge week for you guys. I mean, a real milestone week with you. Obviously, you've now removed the signals from the sectional line from Moorgate to Finsbury Park, and it's a big, big moment. We'll talk a bit about that, I'm sure. But first of all, digital signalling. Ed, starting with you, why? What's the benefit of doing this at all?
Morning, Richard, and thank you for having us on the programme. So it's a really great question, and I think to answer that we have to sort of zoom out beyond ECDP to sort of a macro national context lens, really. The why is embedded in the fact we have a bow wave of signalling renewals due over the next sort of 20 years or so. And given the cost of that and the access requirements and the kind of carbon footprint of that, if we continue to renew conventionally, we'll end up in the same place that we are now, with some deferrals of renewals, life extension works, and ever increasing costs, and the impacts that has on reliability on the network. So that's really a key driver for ECDP's Digital Programme, forging a path towards a sort of digital renewal that becomes the way we do things on the rail network. And I suppose the key elements of that case really are roughly a 40% reduction in signalling unit cost, the cost of signalling, about a 45% reduction in track access to install digital signalling, up to, depending on the scheme, a 33% improvement in system capability and performance, and around about a 40% reduction in embodied carbon. And there's no magic in that. There is simply less kit to install. You'll be familiar with the sort of huge steel gantries that we engineer and stick in the ground simply just to float a light in the optimal position for a driver's eye line. There's huge cost in that. There's obviously a huge carbon footprint in that too. And the system improvements or the capability improvements that come intrinsically as part of the technology, things like automatic train protection, but the ability to be able to optimize block sections on the railway and optimize the performance of the rolling stock that we have out there now.
But I wanted to just pick up on something that you said there about system capabilities. So you said about a 33% improvement in system capability and performance. I guess this is a question to you both, but I'll maybe start with Ollie, because obviously you're running the trains. In terms of system capability, what does it mean to you? Why is it 33% better?
So for us, there's one key thing, is that, and Ed briefly mentioned it there, it's the capability of the train. So what this system does is it understands the braking characteristics of a particular unit. So therefore, it tells you your information in relation to the ability of that train to brake, for example. So therefore, instead of the railway being designed for the lowest common denominator, it's currently all bespoke now for your train's braking ability. So that increases for us the capability that we've got with our trains. A pretty good analogy was I always remember moaning to my dad when I first passed my driving test. I said, why can we only do 70 miles an hour on a motorway? It feels like we go a lot faster. And he said, because there's always one person still driving a Ford Anglia. And all the speeds are set like that, and for the braking distances of that person still driving that old car. Whereas actually we're now unlocking all of that capability within the trains on the network, and we're not, it's not a diesel with a VAC freight, and it's all planned for that and signal side for that. It's now bespoke to that train. And some of the trains that GTR run, the East Coast Main Line, the most modern trains in the UK, really capable of real acceleration and braking. That finally we can unlock the benefits of that, really.
See, so this I think will really excite people, because capacity, as well as just capability, but capacity is at such a premium. So Ed, we talk about the East Coast Main Line, massive issues at the moment. Looking forward to a December 25 timetable that could still have real issues in terms of just squeezing the number of trains on. How much extra capacity do we get with ETCS level 2, which is still a fixed block signaling, but as you've described, it's because it's bespoke to the characteristics of every train. Are we actually going to be able to unlock more capacity?
Potentially, but I think I'd put a note of caution out there that I don't think it's going to unlock reams and reams of new capacity on the East Coast Main Line. So, for example, we've still got constraints like Welwyn Viaduct, two-track railway. We've still got 10 platforms at King's Cross Station. So even if it were to unlock that capacity, you still have other constraints on the network. So for example, our program might unlock an extra path over Welwyn Viaduct if we can get the timetable planning rules to accommodate that, based on the optimization that Ollie's kind of talked about with the trains capability. But actually, the case on the East Coast isn't really built on capacity as such. It's built on the reliability of the signalling system being clearly better because the technology is new and everything's been renewed. And it's built on performance of the network being better because we have that operational flexibility that comes intrinsically with the system. We have the optimized performance of the trains. So that's really the case that it's been built on the East Coast, and that driving revenue growth over time. But there might be some additional capacity available post the program finishing. But a note of caution: it isn't going to be 3, 4, 5 additional paths. And even if there were, there are other constraints on the East Coast Main Line that would probably be more important.
Okay, but no, that's really good. So what you're really saying is it means that what we've got today in terms of capability now just works a lot better, a lot more reliably. And not only that, it saves us. We're spending now to save later, and we've got a big carbon benefit and so on. So that really is the core of it. Okay, get that. That's helpful. Ollie, maybe just turning to you then again. So in terms of the human interface, drivers are now having to learn a very different way of driving, or a very different system. We've all been used to seeing the movement authority being a fixed signal with with an arm or a light on it. This is very different. How has the training program gone, I suppose, and what's the sort of level of acceptance? Do people kind of go, I really like this? How's it work?
So it is really it's one of these systems from a usability point of view. So forget all of the safety assurance and everything to get it over the line, the real sort of nitty gritty. If you're actually looking at it and using it, it's really intuitive. It really is. It wouldn't take long for us to give anyone the basics of what it looks like, what it's trying to show you, and what it's doing. I think big part of my job is, you get a lot of the big stuff at the top that says this is the biggest change in the railway for 200 years. It's all going to happen, and I have to try and manage expectations to the train crew to say, it's not that big actually. It's kind of easy. You haven't got to worry too much about it. And for us, a lot of what we've done is we've tried to get in front of like mess room gossip and concern and worry about it. There was a bit of a thing out there that loads of train drivers might leave because they don't want to accept the change because it's such a big leap. But we haven't seen that at all because really, from a drivability point of view, it's better for the train crew. And once we can describe that to them and show them that suddenly you can see round corners now, you can see loads of meters in front of you, know exactly what's coming up, the gradients, you know everything. They go, oh. And one of my favorite things is on Monday after we moved the signals, a lot of the train crew went, was that it? and that's exactly what we kind of want our train crew to feel about it, you know.
And no, that is fantastic, actually. And if you can get that level of acceptance, that's really, really good. I suppose one of the challenges, though, is what does this mean for the rest of the railway and the rest of the programme? Because Finsbury Park Moorgate's quite a self-contained bit of track, and there's, I suppose, a fairly limited number of drivers who are going over that route. When we now look at East Coast Main Line, there's totally different thing. So, what I guess maybe Ed to begin with, what have you learned from this that will be directly applicable to a much wider rollout?
An awful lot is the answer, Richard. But if there's sort of two or three things I could think about, we've learned particularly that the people element of the change is actually more important than the technology. The technology is largely stable and has been on the Northern City Line since we went live sort of 18 or so months ago. But the issues we've had with things like reliability in the initial phases have been people operational kind of activity. And so we talk about ourselves as a change program rather than a technology driven program, because actually that's the more important element of this. And we want drivers and all operational staff to be not just competent, but confidently competent, and that's what Ollie's been working on over the last 18 months with his people and Network Rail with signallers, for example, is making sure they're confident to use the system. That's probably the biggest learning. Other things, operational scenarios are incredibly important. We've tested, we've simulated loads of stuff in a lab environment, in a factory environment, and on the actual Northern City Line itself. But you can't always legislate for what people do when they aren't in those sterile environments. And so allowing people to run genuine operational scenarios, seeing how they interact with the technology, seeing what they do and what could occur from that has been incredibly important for us to see. And so we need to directly apply that learning to the East Coast Main Line and just allow people almost to play with the system, allow almost people to kind of break it, just to see what will happen, because you cannot possibly simulate every environment. So they're two of the key learnings, I guess, that we will directly apply across the East Coast Main Line.
Do you think this all gets easier in a Great British Railways world because fundamentally we're going to bring track and train together, or is that going to take time? I mean, I'm just fascinated to understand whether there are real benefits from removing interfaces. I mean, Ed, why don't you give that one a go first?
I'm smiling because I guess partly it will, right? And I think you had Andrew on the show, I think last year, and Andrew sort of mentioned that this was the closest thing to impossible he'd come across in his career, or words to that effect. But he said it wasn't impossible; it was close to impossible. GBR will help in some respects, but actually it won't deal with making changes on a train with a 30-year PFI deal. It won't probably deal with the broad range of what I'll sort of broadly call open access, freight and heritage, and open access passenger, for example. And so I think some of that commercial complexity, some of that fragmentation will still exist. For us, that makes no one a bad actor, by the way. That the rules of the game determine how people play it, don't they? So the point of our approach and that partnership approach is, rather than to play it as a kind of conflict game, is to try and change it to play as a cooperative game. And sort of the antidote to that is the partnership that we've employed on Northern City Line, and we'll continue to do so on ECML. So I think it will help in part, but I suppose the reality of our program timeline, as much as the timeline of GBR is, it won't help as much as people might think it would, and we need to continue just to work collaboratively on an online mission.
Very wise words indeed. I mean, I suppose, Ollie, would you say, looking back, that it's been a relatively straightforward program, but although there've been challenges, or we say actually the first one's always the hardest one, and now rolling this out in other places gets easier, not necessarily because of GBR, because of just what you have learned working with Network Rail and other stakeholders. It's just going to get easier as you do more of it. Would that be fair?
I think you said it yourself there, that whole, it doesn't matter if it's 3 miles, 10 miles, it's the first mile that's always the most difficult, right? And you know, we have had a lot of hurdles. You know, it's not it wouldn't be right for us to say and say it's been plain sailing, it's been easy. But the way this program's been set up by NR, you know, they've been very cognizant that actually all that stuff trackside that they very much used to own, it's very clearly theirs, and trains are very clearly ours. They're now actually taking a lot of that, and you're putting them physically together. So therefore, you've got to work in a completely different way. And no, it's been good. It's been we felt listened to, and I think all of us have had benefits from changing that relationship up a little bit.
Well, that's fantastic. Look, thank you so much. Congratulations to you. I mean, I know it's a small step in one sense, but it's actually a massive step. So look, we wish you all the best with the next phase of this. But for now, thanks very much for joining us, and good luck.
So a real step forward, Richard? First one since the pilot, which is antiquated now, from 2011 on the Cambrian.
It's a terrific achievement. It really is. You know, they've done a brilliant job, and it is. I think that first mile or that first bit is always the hardest, isn't it? And hopefully now, you know, they've learned so much about how this system works and how it can be overlaid, and then how it can be sort of transitioned. So tremendous job. It's gone very well.
It must be very exciting and apprehensive, that moment when they switch it on for the first time, with all the signals gone, and they've tested it and trialed it, but that's it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think they've run it in sort of full overlay mode for quite a long time, you know, quite many months.
But even so, once you've chopped the signals,
that's it.
And it's worth remembering how it's financed and paid for, isn't it, Richard?
Well, do you remember last week we talked about the Transport Select Committee and the enhancement program?
I do.
So that well done. It's only been a week.
I was paying attention.
Excellent. Well, so this is part of, and you know, this is an element of enhancement. So this is government funded directly from the DFT. But one of the things that I thought was great about it, you know, was the level of obvious collaboration between, you know, so many people, and they were right to recall the comment Andrew Haynes made on this on green signals way back when he said it's the closest thing to being sort of impossible, just because there's so many interfaces and interactions. And hopefully with GBR it will get better. One of the things that I thought was really interesting about it was the bit about capacity. You know, when we asked, is this going to lead to there being more capacity? And I thought the answer was brilliant. Actually, it was quite, you know, it was all about managing expectations, but very sensibly so. So in other words, we might be able to get a bit more at the margin, but it's not. But things like King's Cross only having X number of platforms, or Welwyn Viaduct, or all that kind of stuff, those constraints all still remain. So this is very much about getting what we've got today working much more reliably. And I thought that was a very sensible outlook to have.
Well, no amount of digital signalling is going to solve a 2-track viaduct with a passenger station at the north end of it, is it?
No, it's not. No, it's not.
Because going back 30 years, I remember Christopher Garnett on GNER used to foam at the mouth about it and wanted to close Welwyn North.
No, but it is. It's a very good point. You know, it's not a silver bullet that fixes all the problems. However, it's still a very, very good thing. You know, well done them for getting to this important milestone.
Absolutely, and we should be keeping our fingers on the pulse and maybe finding out about any differences in driving techniques and experience in the cab from it. I'm interested in that. Maybe other people will be as well.
Indeed.
So let's move on from the very latest technology to some of our oldest. West Coast Railways has been getting the attention of many listeners and viewers in the last week for not one, but 2 stories that are quite lively which have emerged. It's been reported that on May 9th, the operator ran a private charter train, believed to be for a wedding party, using, wait for it, Mark 1 stock without central door locking fitted. So, pick the bones out of that, Richard.
Yeah, now as you rightly said, you know, it's been reported that. And so we need to just put the context around this, because as regular listeners and followers of this story will know, as the regulations stand at the moment with respect to Mark 1 or hinged door rolling stock, you're not allowed to run them unless they're fitted with central door locking, or you have an exemption, and that exemption tends to be to enable a fully financed and supported plan to fit it, right? So
it's coming.
It's not an open-ended thing, right? Exactly. And that exemption comes from the Office of Rail and Road, the regulator. So the first thing we did when we heard about this was we asked West Coast Railways to confirm it, if it's correct that they ran this private charter, and whether it was as has been suggested for a wedding, and secondly, if that was the case, how they felt able to do that under the current regulations. And we're still waiting for a reply, which we're sure must be on its way. But we're still waiting to hear from that. So until we've heard that, there's an element of we're not absolutely certain what's happened here. We've not had it confirmed who was on the train, but there are videos and photographs all over the internet.
Plenty of them.
Yeah, showing that they ran a train using Mark 1s on May the 9th, I think it was, pulled by a steam engine with a couple of Class 47s, right? Now, this is where it gets a bit interesting. There's been a chat about it online,
hasn't there?
With many people suspecting that therefore they must have run the train with non-fare paying passengers on board. Why? Why is that relevant? Well, if you look at the Railway Safety Regulations 99, the RSR 99 guide that the ORR puts out on this very subject, it does actually say in clause 1.16, and this is from their 2021 version of the document, it says, where hinged door rolling stock is not carrying fare-paying passengers, it is excluded from the prohibition on the operation of rolling stock with hinged doors. And then the guide goes on to give an example, but I think it's only an example the way it's written. It says, this may happen when vehicles are occupied by train support crew only. And so therefore the key is what is meant by fare-paying passengers, because if they're non-fare paying and it's an absolute black and white interpretation, then it has been suggested that is why they were able to do it.
Now, that's interesting because West Coast Chairman David Smith suggested to Trackside magazine over a year ago that he would consider running free trains for the Jacobite. So maybe it's not unthinkable that he might have decided to do that here. He told Trackside in April 2024, you could go up to Fort William tomorrow and run up and down every day as long as we don't charge. It only affects fare-paying passengers, so we could run trains and not charge for them without any problem. Where does the safety come in then? So it seems as if West Coast's interpretation of the rules at the time was that they could run with free passengers. Do you think that holds water, Richard?
Well, that's certainly what the chairman seemed to suggest back when he had that interview with Trackside. You're right. And as we must stress again, we're still waiting for West Coast Railways to confirm or deny what actually happened and how they were comfortable with the regulations on this particular train. Now, but absent that, I would say this. I personally think, and it is my personal opinion, that's all it is, that a reasonable interpretation of fare-paying passenger is that actually that they're not, that they are a member of the public, right? What do I mean by that? Well, whether a company has been whether anybody's been negligent towards an individual is not really relevant, whether they've paid or not, or whether they've had it for free or not. You're still bound by the duty of care. So if you and I traveled on a train and I paid for your ticket as well as mine, you're not a fare-paying passenger in one sense, but the company still owns exactly the same duty of care to you that it does to me, right? And to suggest anything different to that, I think would be absurd. So I think it is one reasonable interpretation of the rules that you just can't run Mark 1s if they don't have CDL or an exemption, and have people on who are effectively members of the public. I'm not really convinced the fare paying bit. I think that they're using that as a general descriptor rather than something as precise as which person actually paid. I mean, that's, but as I say, that's my view. At some point, I'm presuming we will discover what West Coast think of that, and more importantly, what the OR think of that.
Well, we asked the ORR to comment on this, and here was the response. We are aware of reports suggesting West Coast Railways ran a train consisting of Mark I carriages that were not fitted with central door locking. We have contacted West Coast Railways for further information. So we'll just wait and see what happens with that one. But there was a further related interesting story to this in The Scotsman by Alistair Dalton over the weekend, headlined Harry Potter Jacobite train operator slammed for substitute Primark carriages. Ouch, that sounds a bit serious. Let's explain. Now, apparently, this is because West Coast Railways has been running BR Intercity Mark II blue and grey carriages from the 1960s on some of its trains. On its website, a West Coast statement says this: due to the extreme weather conditions we have experienced from the start of our 2025 season, we are having to carry out additional and essential maintenance on our carriages lasting for a few weeks. Some of the normal carriages used on the Jacobite service are to be replaced with our ex-British Rail Intercity rolling stock in their traditional colours of blue and grey. The use of these carriages on the Jacobite service is a rare opportunity, especially when hauled by a historic steam engine, weather permitting. Except due to the dry weather conditions of late, many of its services have also been running without a steam engine either, due to the fire risk. According to the Scotsman article, the Friends of the West Highland Lines has commented that it's like seeing a Marks and Spencer store from the pavement and going in and finding out it's Primark. Surely not great for business, Richard, eh?
Yeah, and I thought that comment in the press release about a rare opportunity to travel in a Mark II was maybe stretching things a bit. And, look, if you've paid a lot of money, what is it? Like if you paid £100 or more for a ticket on what you expected to be that sort of classic Mark I Harry Potter style experience, and then you find yourself in a Mark II coach behind a diesel, that's not really, you could argue that's not really what it said on the tin. Now, look, the Jacobite's been afforded the title of the world's best railway journey in the past. People come from all around the world to
They do
experience something special. And as we've said before, enormous credit to West Coast Railways for building up,
inventing this job,
what has been a fantastic brand. That is to their immense credit. However, losing the compartment stock, that's one thing. Not being able to run heritage carriages at all, or certainly not Mark I's, that's another thing. Not being able to run a steam engine, although the fire risk thing is a real issue, and they've got to act responsibly, and there are constraints, and so we get that. But it does feel at the moment that the Jacobite is not delivering on its
promise
marketing pitch. Yeah.
And as a result, there are some truly awful reviews appearing on TripAdvisor, giving West Coast 1 star for dirty windows, being overpriced, not having any relation to the Harry Potter films now, poor quality refreshments, and uncomfortable seats. It's a litany of criticisms. Quite a few people have pointed out that you could do the same trip on ScotRail for less than half the cost, which goes to your point, Richard. You're paying for that experience, aren't you, not the journey? And that's the problem. The higher cost is only acceptable if the experience matches what people expect. We had a message from a green signaller who knew someone waiting for a train at Fort William, and they commented on the palpable atmosphere on the platform when the train arrived and clearly wasn't what people were expecting to see and travel on. But by far the most extraordinary part of the Scotsman article for me, Richard, was a quote from West Coast commercial manager James Shuttleworth about why the BR Mark IIs are on the trains. Direct quote here: "They're being used as they are already fitted with central door locking until such time as we gain an exemption for the Mark I vehicles. Dialogue is ongoing with the ORR," close quotes. I have to say, I was a bit taken back by that, Richard. What do you think?
Well, it's quite presumptuous.
Yes.
But he may be right, who's to say? We don't have the detail of everything yet. It does rather suspect that they believe they're going to get another exemption. I just think this is actually all quite sad, because if West Coast had just got on, fitted CDL like everybody else did, and invested in that stock the way that others have invested in theirs, I think they would have a product second to none. Because their vision's been brilliant and the way they've marketed it has been great. They're just in danger of it falling away now, and I think that's really sad.
How often do you find a railway product that is so popular, filled, loved by the media as well as everybody else, and is, I suppose, in many ways, a license to print money, and see it being screwed up like this? If they'd only fitted CDL, as you say, it would be such a different story. Right, let's move on to a story about Yorkshire, Richard, for a pair of Lancastrians. Yorkshire folk are known to be savvy, and their politicians are to be commended at the very least for their rather shrewd timing of former Home Secretary David Blunkett's £14 billion 15-year plan to catch up on decades of deferred investment in the region's railways. Now, the canny timing of the Blunkett report, shortly before a government spending review, which will decide which infrastructure projects go ahead, requires just $2.4 billion by 2030 to make a start on the mega improvements outlined. Blunkett has, I get the impression, done his best to make the short-term costs at least more palatable, or at the very least less painful. So what's he proposing, Richard?
Well, it's an interesting report. It's dubbed, they've dubbed it the sort of the White Rose region. That's a region that's got a population of 4.6 million. If you include all the sort of the metropolitan areas, and it's grown by 500,000 in the last decade. So it's a growing region. Okay. According to the report, it generates gross value added of around 127 billion to the national economy. That's a big number.
It is.
But it also, the report says, it's actually 25 billion less than it should be and could be if only we got our infrastructure right. And the railway is a key part of that. So that's all positive stuff. Now, there's 6 initiative areas, I suppose. When you look at the rail bit, it talks about six key themes. So they're calling for new trains and sufficient rolling stock to deliver reliable services, although it should be noted that Northern have got a procurement underway for 450 trains, so just bear that in mind. It calls for the development of strategic schemes such as Northern Powerhouse Rail, which again is something that's been long discussed, but it says we need to do that. We want some new and or enhanced rail services, frequency improvements to boost connectivity, and it gives us some examples, one of which I think is really very important is the Leeds-Sheffield corridor. That's important. It then calls for number 4 is infrastructure capacity improvements. It actually says, which is, people will read this in different ways. It calls for delivering a package of infrastructure improvements that are already in development. Okay, so but nonetheless, infrastructure is a key part of it. Number 5, accessible stations and new stations, and then finally rail devolution, which is something that the Rail Reform Bill is talking about, and the English Devolution White Paper is also talking about. So you can read that one of 2 ways. You can take the slightly skeptical view and say, well, most of that has already either been discussed or is happening. Or you could say, actually, do you know what? At least it's all been brought together in one place. And
by 3 mayors working together.
And there is very much that sort of pan-regional focus, and repetition's not a bad thing. So, depends what point of view you want to take, but that's what it's calling for.
I agree. It does feel like some of this stuff has been underway for a while. Good to see about Leeds-Sheffield electrification over 29, 30 miles or thereabouts. And things like Bradford's existing station at Forster Square is restricted and relatively poorly served terminus routed from Shipley, which has long been a bone of contention. And there was actually a major step forward in mid-May when LNER launched a new 7 trains a day direct service to King's Cross from a new £35 million platform. Great
I know.
scheme, although it was originally projected to cost 24 million.
I know. Well, there we go again. And that inflation's actually quite a, it's that worrying trend, isn't it? I sort of read this and I was trying to work out who the real audience was. Because if you sort of say, well, what does it tell us about rail strategy we didn't really know before? The answer's not really very much, okay? But what it does do is it kind of brings it together, and maybe the audience is a different audience then. I did feel there was a little bit, because of that stuff that's already been talked about, that is a bit of an issue. But I think what really grated with me, I don't know if you took the same view on this, Nigel. There's lots of cliches.
Oh, God, broken railways, God knows what.
A creaking infrastructure. You literally add your list that you could sort of tick off. That, I think that's a shame when they do that. But
cliche bingo.
There was a bit of that. But again, it just depends on who you think the audience here really is. And maybe in a spending review year, actually the audience is a very, very specific one.
And a very general one. You touched on it earlier, the idea that you've got three mayors here being seen to be working together in the region. And they do make a pretty good fist of putting together why these improvements are necessary. And you can see that they really want to do that because they over-egg it to a degree. At one point, I was thinking, yes, please just move on.
There was a bit of that. No,
you're
right.
You've convinced me you don't need to go into every line. Yeah. So I just wonder if the local people and the local media, this is a positioning move to get everybody behind them so that going forward, you've got a springboard for more, not necessarily announcements, but more agitation and campaigning for better railways because everybody's kind of on the same page and can quote some of the numbers, can't they? I mean, the report's full of good numbers. That Leeds is massive delays, one of the worst in the country, and it ripples across the whole network. The transport spending per head is way down. All that sort of thing. I think I do think is powerful stuff. I don't disagree with what you say, but I'm not quite sure I'm as sceptical as you are on this one.
Okay, but I'll challenge that slightly and say the one area where I'm a bit sceptical is because when you frame it in the context of what is likely to come up next in the spending review, and arguably where the railway needs to focus its priorities, right? We know it's going to be a very, very difficult spending review.
Oh, yes.
We suspect that the consequences of it will be some significant belt tightening across all sort of manner of budgets. And in fairness to the report, I mean, it focuses a lot on the fact that what we have today is not as reliable as it could be and must be. And there's nothing wrong with that. So if you look at it and say, well, where should the railway be focused on in the next 3-5 years, whatever it is, I would come back, as I do every time.
Your usual mantra, yeah.
It is performance, get a grip of costs, and sort out the fare system, because that's probably one of the biggest barriers to people wanting to travel that we've got. Those are the three things. And I wouldn't say abandon hope on anything else, but if you do those three things, good things flow from that. It gives you a really strong base.
Springboard.
Absolutely. Now, what Andrew Haynes said at the Transport Select Committee recently was, and actually that's where we're focused on as a railway, that operation maintenance renewal stuff, the enhancement stuff is treated differently. There is an integration. There is an overlap. We all accept that. So if this report is really just about giving a strong regional identity and making the case again, what have we always said? Tell them what you're going to say, tell them, then tell them again. If that's what it's doing and just saying, don't forget, we have been underfunded, we have been underinvested, and you've got to sort that out, great, right? But I don't think it changes the reality of where the railway as a whole needs to focus its priorities. That's my view.
I agree. We certainly, they shouldn't see the shining light on the horizon of opportunity, have them take their eye off kind of carrying on creating the boring, dull, reliable railway, which is needed first.
Well, you've just found 20 words to summarise what I use 300. Absolutely right. Okay. Don't be distracted. Focus on what matters. If you fix that, good stuff comes from that.
But I don't think there's anything wrong with articulating ambition and vision in an upbeat way. If only, let's not forget, we do not want to demotivate hundreds of thousands and tens of thousands of railway men and women who are struggling with a network which is, it's not broken, but it is struggling.
I agree. But then again, you've always been the upbeat half of this double act. So, yeah.
And you're normally Mr. Grumpy. Yeah, that's right.
Outrageous suggestion. Right.
Right. And now it's time to thank everyone who supports us, which we will always do. First of all, thanks to our programme supporter, RIA, the Railway Industries Association, and to Rail Business Daily, our media supporter. And of course, a huge thank you to everyone who has clicked the button on YouTube and left us a super thanks. And you all are Bob Walsh, Richard Skelton, Nigel Mapston, Marion Bloom, Callum Thorneloe, Andrew Seddon, Alan Kirkman, Chris Exley, Caroline Cleveley, Graham Whitley, Alistair Rutledge, Sean Harris and John Kirkman. Thanks so much to all of you taking the trouble to do that. It does give us a little buzz every time we see one come through, and they do make an enormous difference to us. So thanks from all three of us.
Yeah, indeed. They do make a huge difference, as do all our members who support us on both YouTube and Patreon. We're enormously grateful. You do get to see all the members in our end credits where we thank people very publicly. If you're not a member and you do enjoy Green Signals, then do have a look at membership. We do quite a lot of extra stuff. We've got more extra stuff planned. You get some goodies as well. But we're just very grateful for everybody who does support us through membership because it helps us do all of this.
So say all of us. And now it's time for this week's Railway News Roundup. First, there was a story in The Telegraph and Rail magazine last week saying that HS2 has been delayed again to between 2036 and 2039 and will cost £100 billion. The stories say that this information has come from HS2 Limited's Chief Executive Mark Wilde in a report for the DFT. We thought this was a bit of an odd story, actually, because no report has surfaced. We couldn't find one. And Mark Wilde is actually part way through a reset of the project. So we asked HS2 Limited about it, and they said this. Mark Wilde, our chief executive, has been clear that HS2 faces serious cost and schedule challenges. He is now undertaking a comprehensive review which will report to government in due course and lead to a full reset of the company and project. This work is yet to be concluded, and given the scale and complexity of HS2, it's vital that Mark is given the time to carry it out properly. So there's a few things that are really worth noting here. Mark Wilde has always been clear that the costs are going to rise significantly on the project unless the programme is successfully reset. He said as much at the Public Accounts Committee. He also only presents numbers that are for the whole programme. So where the Rail article says that the £100 billion is thought not to include the cost of trains, Euston Station or the signalling, that's pretty unlikely to be the case. Seems to be a good amount of scaremongering going on here when we all know that Mark is doing this review for exactly the reason of addressing the cost and schedule.
And it will be important in any final analysis to really understand the impact of that horrible word again, inflation, right? Because the last official numbers were at 2019 prices. We're now at 2025, and we know what's happened in the interim. So we'll break all that down in due course. And
just to butt in for a sec, the one stat that Andrew Haynes came up with at the TSC, which keeps going round in my head, is how ballast has gone up by 80%.
Yeah,
80.
I mean, fortunately, we haven't got any on HS2, but I know. But concrete has gone up by some absolutely humongous number as well.
It's just an illustration of those massive inflation.
No, you're absolutely right. Here's another kind of high-speed story. Actually, did you like the little segue there?
I did.
Smooth indeed. This one was sent in to us by Peter Curtis, John Kirkman. A report in the High Speed News Online has suggested that double-decker trains could run to London. Apparently, Alstom CEO Henri Poupard-Lafarge told the Financial Times that double-deck trains would increase traffic on routes between London and the continent, although they would need regulatory approval which might take years to get. He said, we can propose through the tunnel, whether it's Eurostar or other competitors, we'll see. Okay. Because, of course, High Speed 1 and the international platforms and the approaches to St Pancras have been built to UIC GB plus profile, unlike the rest of the UK infrastructure. I have always wondered why this has not been really pushed before, because it's such an obvious way to me to increase capacity. So let's see. Interesting story.
And you can get those trains within the existing envelope, as you said.
Correct.
So
Correct.
Why not? It's the Channel Tunnel and the Safety Authority and everything else, isn't it? The approval that's going to take
Indeed.
time. Oh, here we go. Deep breath. I'm not sure I even want to read this story. Can I just skip it? Because I'm just imagining your face already. Thanks to David Redgewell. Thank you, David, for sending it to us, though you may regret it. The Borders Railway, which is coming up to its 10th anniversary, is apparently costing double its earnings. This came up at a meeting of Midlothian Council, apparently, where plans were being discussed to celebrate the upcoming anniversary. Councillor Peter Smale told the meeting that the Borders line cost £14 million to operate each year, but was only bringing in around £7 million in revenue. He apparently said that the average ticket cost £3.90, but the average subsidy is £3.92. Now, the news report in Edinburgh Live that quoted what Peter Smale said pointed out that the figures came from a 2019/20 report. So we asked ScotRail to comment on this, and they confirmed the same and pointed us to a 2024 economic impact report, which sadly doesn't break the figures down in the same way. So Smale was using the latest publicly available breakdown of the figures. Apparently, Smale and the other council members have called for a review of the success of the line, and lessons can be learned. Oh, go on then, Richard.
Well, I do find it very odd that people are surprised that lines like the Borders do require operating subsidy to run. And it's not a problem. Why is that a problem? You will be surprised by this, right? Of course, it's going to require some support. You go and find me a single line in the country that actually financially washes its face. There will be some incremental services that do, but when you got rid of everything else that didn't work, you'd suddenly find that the ones that did now had to bear all the cost and didn't work themselves, right? We don't appraise projects on whether or not they financially wash their face. We appraise projects on whether or not they deliver social benefit and economic returns that pass a hurdle rate compared to their costs. So I have to say, just the fact that it's not washing its face financially doesn't mean it was the wrong thing to do at all. The lessons learned, though, are to really now understand whether you can make the case for probably going to Howick or further. That's where it becomes very important. So there you go.
And actually, Scotland Rail Supremo Bill Reeve has always been consistent that it's not just a train service, an economic development tool for the Borders, which speaks to your comments about wider social benefits and all the rest of it.
Yeah, but just on this, I know this is the news round and we don't normally dive into things too deeply. I was surprised at some of the comments on our YouTube channel last week when we'd been talking about this very subject. Yeah, and there still seems to be some extraordinary misunderstanding about how projects are appraised. They are not appraised solely on the financial performance. They are and always have been appraised on a combination of financial and wider social benefits, right? Now, there is no doubt that over recent years, our understanding and analysis of how to calculate those wider social benefits has improved, right? And we are better at it, and more stuff is getting included, but they've never been solely appraised on financial performance alone, right? That's just a fact.
Maybe we ought to do a bit of a special feature on it sometime, Richard.
Maybe we can dive
details.
into web tag and other wonderfully
your
related,
excitement will be unbounded. Meanwhile, back to the news.
Now back to the news. Okay. Well, a victory here for disabled passengers. Thanks to Steve Roberts for sending this one in. Do you remember that case back in, I think it was 2023, when a passenger had booked assistance that then didn't arrive, and he started a claim against Network Rail? Well, the person in question was, passenger was called Doug Pawley.
I know Doug.
He's a disability rights campaigner. The Ombudsman, the Rail Ombudsman, awarded him £125 in compensation, which was £100 for the assistance failure and £25 for complaints handling. He actually refused the offer and was eventually awarded £1,325 in the courts. Well, now the ORR has written to operators to consult on revising its accessible travel policy guidance so that redress claims are considered on the circumstances of each claim rather than just the cost of the ticket, taking into account the impact on the passenger of failing to provide assistance. And it's hoped and expected, I think, that it's going to provide more of an incentive to operators to ensure that assistance is always provided. There's no point in having a service if it then isn't delivered.
Can be very hit and miss. I've seen it myself. And it must be really distressing. Anyway, here's a positive story to end the news round on, Richard, sent in by Trevor Stone, our old chum. The last Southeastern Class 395 Javelin to receive an interior refresh has now re-entered passenger service, completing the first phase of a £27 million upgrade of 29 trains. The second phase is now underway to provide improved passenger information and a new exterior livery. And that is the news roundup for this week. If you'd like to send us any snippets of news or big pieces of news from around you or across the country, please do so. We do miss some things and we'd rather be told twice than miss it altogether. And if we use your email, we'll give you a name check, as we have done today.
Which means it's now time to do the quiz. Now, last week's question was this. Where on Britain's railway might Batman have lived? We got some fantastic answers to this, including a brilliant one, which referenced £100 million shed in the HS2, which I thought was clearly tongue-in-cheek, but nonetheless very funny. Anyway, the answer, of course, is related to the film. He lives in Gotham City. Now, there are two places that we accepted as correct answers. One is spelt the same way, but I understand it's pronounced Gotham, and it's near Ruddington, isn't it?
It is.
On the Great Central.
There was a quarry siding to Gotham, yeah.
So Gotham, spelt Gotham, was a great answer. If you said that it might have also been in the Peak District in Derbyshire on the Cromford High Peak Railway. Now, I don't know if it's pronounced Gotham or Gotham Curve, but there was a curve on the Cromford and High Peak, which was reputedly the tightest radius curve
one. Right.
on a sort of a main line, or an operating line. So, i.e., not in a siding or in a docks or something. And it was absolutely fearsomely tight. There's some great videos on YouTube. So either
Shot
of those
from
two
the train, so you can see the engine,
and usually from a brake van as well. You literally feel like you can actually touch the engine.
Yes.
You know, so tight is the curve. So either of those were acceptable. And so the winner, randomly chosen from all the very many correct answers we had, was David Leng. So well done, David. If you could just send us an email again to quiz@greensignals.org, and we will be delighted to get your mug out to you. I've got about 3 or 4 to do this week, so I'll get all of those out. Right, this week's question. Recently, we've had the Overground. They've renamed some of the Overground lines Lioness, Mildmay, Windrush, Weaver, Suffragette. I know that's some of them. So new lines, new names for the lines. However, performance on one London commuter railway in the 90s was so poor that it earned a very unwanted and unofficial name. What was the line and what was it called? And if you think you know the answer to that, Nigel, this is outrageous. He's getting them all right. I clearly need to make
clearly making them easier.
No, sorry about that. If you think you know, answers to quiz@greensignals.org by this coming Saturday, which is May 24th. We'll put all the answers into a hat and draw one out at random, who will receive a Green Signal quiz winners mug.
Excellent. And here's a positive story to end on, Richard. Northern, Network Rail and the BTP, the Transport Police, used drones during the Easter school holidays as part of a trespass crackdown in the northeast. Well, it was successful and caught a young trespasser throwing stones at trains, a train spotter walking along the line to take photographs, and 2 teenagers, wait for it, lying on a level crossing who ran from the tracks when they saw the drone. Because it was so successful over Easter, Northern NR and the BTP are planning to employ similar tactics over the summer holidays, alongside their usual visits to schools and other interventions. I'm always amazed at how stupid people can be.
It is incredible, isn't it? So fantastic use of technology there. Is worth, if people haven't seen it, we did a special feature video on trespass when we went up to Yorkshire and spent some time with Network Rail and the teams there and the British Transport Police. It was a real eye-opener and definitely worth a watch. That's on our channel.
Some horrific video. And the other thing, Seb, about drones, of course, is it's pretty cheap technology, certainly compared with helicopters.
Indeed.
Okay, and sadly, that's all we've got time for this week. So thank you so much for watching or listening. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, or if you haven't already, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. It really does help us. And all you have to do is click the button. It doesn't cost you anything. And if you really want to support us, find out about membership on YouTube or Patreon, which will give you all sorts of cool stuff, focused largely around some of our special videos that we've all had a hand in making. But most importantly, join us again this time next week for this show, which will always be completely free. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Have a great week.